Thank you so much. Well, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I'm Sage Revell. I'm a partner at Rudnick. We're a Boston headquartered law firm. I'm based in the London office here, so sorry I can't be with you in person today. And I am joined by Alice Zheng from RH Capital. So my legal background is I'm a corporate attorney. I focus on life sciences and technology as sector focuses. I have done for many, many years. But in the last couple of years, I've become somewhat of an advocate for women's health. It's a subject very close to my heart, and I look forward to having this discussion with Alice today. So, Alice, if you could just give us a little bit more of a background about yourself and your position at RH.
Great. Thank you so much to Startup Boston for having this panel and to Suffolk University for hosting. It's wonderful to see everybody virtually and in person. And always happy to speak about my favorite topic, which is women's health. So my background is that I've been in the space for a number of years wearing different hats. I've been on the public health side of women's health, working in East Africa and Asia in global health settings. I've also been a clinician, so I did train in medicine, and I would have become an OBGYN, but I didn't because I became interested in the business side of women's health, and I spent a number of years in consulting at McKinsey, which included broad healthcare work and a specific focus on women's health within that. And my other couple of hats, one is as a patient. I've experienced many different women's health conditions myself, such as infertility, difficult pregnancies, and currently I'm an investor at a women's health specialized fund called RH Capital. So that means that we only invest in conditions that affect women, although we are pretty broad in terms of sector, life sciences, health services, et cetera. The focus is really only on women's health.
Thanks. So just before we start this chat, and we really want it to be an interactive session as well, so welcome questions at the end. Alice and I are going to have a discussion on FemTech, but before we get there, I just actually wanted to address effectively what FemTech actually is, because a lot of people they think they know, but they aren't really sure. So sorry if I'm stating the obvious here, but effectively it's innovation in women's health and wellness, straddling both life sciences and technology. And I just wanted to also give you a little bit of a historical context and some interesting facts to kick off this session. So, as I'm sure this won't surprise many of you, but modern medicine was developed based on a foundation of male subjects. The differences in the complexities of the female body versus the male body have not historically been considered. Research has historically favored male interests, and this leads to persistent gender disparities and in diagnostics, treatment, and in care. A classic example is women are more likely to die of a heart attack than men. I also learned that Alzheimer's affects women far worse than men. And so clinical studies have long been conducted exclusively with male participants. And this also leads to incorrect prescriptions and dosages for women, which can be very dangerous. But on a sort of side note, I actually learned recently that the female Viagra was tested on a group of men. So I'm not really sure how that works, but just to give you an idea of how far we've had to come since then, and that really wasn't that long ago. That was in 2016. And just to give you a couple more dates here to highlight the disparity, it wasn't until 1993 that the National Institutes of Health mandated that clinical trials receiving federal funding have to include women and minorities. Now, 1993 was really not that long ago. But here we are. So I'd like to just hand over to Alice now just to expand a little bit more on the definition of FemTech, what that means to her, and in the broader women's health innovation trends space.
Yes. Thank you, Sage, for that really great overview and such shocking facts. Like for me, even having trained in clinical medicine, I never thought about the fact that my anatomy textbooks mostly contained, male drawings, except for reproductive organs, which were female. But women are not small men. And the examples that you gave are just really astounding. It really affects everything from the way that we understand biology and practice medicine. For example, as you mentioned, women are more likely to die of heart attack. And it's because women have different types of heart attack than men, but the ones that women have are actually taught in clinical medicine as atypical, right? Because the typical one is the left arm pain, heart pain or chest pain, and that's actually just not how women experience heart attacks. You also mentioned some examples in the drug development space. Indeed, women were left out of clinical trials for a number of years at first with good intent to prevent fetal defects, but it wasn't just pregnant women, it was all women left out. The other fact that I'll just raise is that, other than broader healthcare, if you think about women-specific conditions like endometriosis, like maternal health, there's been just a historical underinvestment. We don't have a lot of deep biological understanding. We don't have great new therapies. We don't have diagnostics. The good news is that things are starting to change. So part of my role when I was at McKinsey was to really look at the broader innovation landscape in women's health. And I will say that, number of years ago, there were really a couple hundred companies max, in this FemTech sector, and that has just blossomed a ton, and it's been really great to see that. And a couple other trends I'll just point out to set some context is, FemTech was coined by Ida Tin at Clue, which is a company that has a period tracking app, and that really was the birth, I would say, of FemTech, of women taking things into their own hands. Big pharma, big device companies are not innovating for women's health, so got to do it ourselves. And FemTech really grew out of that type of tech focused, consumer focused space. And since then, there's been many waves that started with period tracking, and then there's a whole wave of pregnancy, fertility, educational apps. Then other hotspots have emerged now, I would say, in menopause and pelvic health and other areas. And all of these were previously very stigmatized, and it's great to see the destigmatization that has accompanied greater investment and innovation in the space.
Absolutely, and I think you mentioned when the phrase femtech was coined, I believe that was actually in 2016. So again, very recent history, but we're getting there. It's growing exponentially, which is good news.
Yeah. So I will say, I personally have a love-hate relationship with the word femtech. In some ways, I think it's done an amazing job really gathering the enthusiasts in women's health and bringing attention, changing the conversation. There are some that hear that and think, oh, that's just referring to the consumer stuff. And, I'm a life science investor. That's not what I look at. And some actually now use the term to mean all of women's health, including therapeutics and devices and all of that. So I think it's a very useful way to find fellow enthusiasts. We just want to make sure we define it, as we talk about it. And say it just seems like, perhaps for this conversation, we are defining it, pretty broadly to include not just the consumer and tech-enabled types of products and services, but also just really all of women's health, which is quite expansive.
Absolutely, I think so, and I think it's a pretty, unfortunately, a fairly small subsector right now, and getting bigger. But I think just widening the net as far as possible. Hopefully, we'll have subsectors of femtech in the near future when we get there. So, Alice, you mentioned in your sort of background before becoming a principal at RH Capital, you worked as a women's health practice leader at McKinsey. So, would you be able to just tell us a little bit more about your journey there and your experience, and just to give us a bit more background?
Sure. Yeah. Just some context setting. So McKinsey is a very large management consulting firm that works with mostly Fortune 500 companies. I was there mostly working across the healthcare sector. So that's including payer, provider, device, pharma, and a little bit of global health. And the women's health practice. So there's many practice areas, pharma, there's specific oncology and other areas. Women's health, when I first joined, many years ago, it really wasn't, there wasn't much of a practice. There were a handful of OBs in the company. And, as a, almost an OB, I got involved with some of that work. And I still remember when I started looking more, FemTech was growing. I was doing some research in the space, and I was brought into a call with a private equity client. And we were talking about, what are some hot investment areas and hot topics. And I was on a call with, all men. And one of them said, femtech, that sounds way too progressive for us. And that really, probably was a sentiment. And this is a number of years ago. And what was exciting is by the time that I left, it actually was a topic of conversation throughout many areas. So hospital systems were talking about women's health innovation and femtech. Pharma companies that had tried to divest their portfolios in women's health were saying, actually, maybe there is something here. And also externally, outside of the Fortune 500 companies, there were just an incredible growth of startups in the space. startups as well as funds, such as the fund that I'm at now, which is actually fully dedicated in women's health. A couple of things that I worked on in the consulting role was really landscaping the space. What I noticed that there was a lack of alignment around the definition of what is women's health, not just what's FemTech, but what's women's health. Is it maternal health? Is it about fertility? And different players use the term differently. And so one of the things we sought out to do was to really define the space. And an emerging definition that was used by many different groups is really that women's health includes conditions specific to women, such as maternal health and fertility and menopause, as well as conditions that affect women disproportionately, such as Alzheimer's, as Sage mentioned, and then also areas that affect women differently, such as cardiac care. So really, women's health is quite expansive. And the other access to think about is, women's health means the care that we receive in the health system and any biases that we're experiencing. It also includes new drug and diagnostic innovation, as well as, what was FemTech, which now is brought in, but the consumer tech-enabled sector as well. So you can think of women's health really as a matrix of those two axes. And we did some analyses on where do we see hot pockets and where do we see innovation. The other thing that I'll mention is as the space has grown, there's been a lot of attempts to measure the size of the market. And I do think that is really tough. Oftentimes, market size is determined by revenues of the companies within that space, which works for mature spaces. But women's health is very emerging at this point. And so, we don't have a lot of public companies. Private companies are often not reporting revenue, or they're pre-revenue because they're in R&D phase. So it's really not going to tell us a whole lot to look at revenue numbers. The other is really to look at the potential. And this is where I think we can get a sense of just how expansive women's health is. We know that there are large numbers, we're half the population. There are a lot of unmet clinical needs and conditions that affect large populations as well, such as endometriosis, which affects 5 or 10% of women of reproductive age. There's a lot of need, there's numbers, and this is just really a space that's really ripe for innovation disruption, given that we haven't had a full 10 in the past couple of decades.
Yeah, wow. Well, it looks like your journey. You certainly, maybe if they didn't start off with that much in the way of FemTech, certainly by the time you left, it was a lot more than when you started. So you were there for how many years?
So I was there for about 5 years, and definitely there was
5 years.
huge transformation in the level of interest among corporates and strategics. And yes, and I will say these days, large, funds like Goldman Sachs has a women's health division. It's just incredible seeing how it was not a topic for many large companies before, but now it's really on the agenda. And it's in public discourse, it's in the Super Bowl, it's on the agenda in a lot of places. And I'm so thankful that Startup Boston has also included a session on this topic.
Yeah, amazing. So then from McKinsey to RH, so quite a different role, but obviously still sticking to the same theme of women's health. Can you give us a bit more insight into RH Capital and the role that you play there?
Sure. I'll comment a little bit on the transition before talking about the fund. And I will say, there is no one path to venture capital. There are some who start from more of the banking, private equity path, and that's, I would say, more the junior levels. Nobody ever looks for consultant to join their fund, really. But I think there's actually a lot of really useful and translatable learnings from consulting into venture. And for me, I just love having a bird's eye view of our space, looking at trends and working with companies. And there's definitely a lot of that in venture capital, which is really fun. In terms of RH Capital in particular, so we are one of the few funds dedicated to women's health. There's, I would say, 5 or 6 in the US, there's a couple globally. We are all, early stage funds looking at women's health conditions. And we have different definitions. There are, some that define women's health very broadly, as I mentioned before. Even anything that touches a woman is women's health. For us, we're a bit more focused on reproductive health. And so that really is menstruation to menopause and everything in between. We invest across various segments. So in any given day, I might be talking to a company that's turning blood cells into eggs for IVF, for example, to another company which is addressing Black maternal mortality. So very, very different types of business models. different types of problems that they're addressing, but all under the guise of how can we make a significant impact in the space. So our fund has been around for about 3 or 4 years, and that actually makes us one of the older and larger ones, and which just tells you, how much of an emerging space this is. We have about 20 companies in that portfolio today, and we're really excited about the impact that each and every one is having.
That's great. And look, I know that you're relatively young as a fund, and so obviously, you perhaps not seen so many exits yet, but it would be great if we could have a success story from you. So describe an investment or two that you've led in the FemTech space and why you're excited about them in particular.
Yep. Yeah, it's an interesting time right now in venture. I joined a couple of years ago, which I would say was a bit of a heyday. There was a lot of free flowing cash from the LPs to funds, and therefore funds into startups. And we're in a different time now. We're in a bit of a economic. Let's see, it's not a recession, but there definitely is some just slowdown in the venture space. But that said, we have been very active as a fund. So we closed our fund 2 last fall with almost 40 million under management. And we've been very active this year investing. And just in my portfolio alone, we added 3 new companies and also did a follow-on in a company that I first invested when I first joined. And they're all very different, and I'm really excited about the impact. So just to kind of give a sense of the types of excitement that we're seeing. So one company is called AOA. And this is in the ovarian cancer space. Ovarian cancer is a condition where there really is, there's no way to screen for it really. And even early diagnosis is tough because the symptoms are very vague and we don't have any actual early detection tests. The real way to diagnose is really we can't even biopsy actually, is you have to have kind of an open surgery. So this company has developed a biomarker that is shed from the cancer cell into the bloodstream so that you can actually detect it with a blood test, so nothing invasive. And also it's present even in the very, very early stages, stage 1A, in fact. So this is a company that's very much in the R&D phase. It's on the life science side, and that is something we need more of in women's health. And on the other end of the spectrum, I invested in a company called Millie, which is a maternal care company. And this company has a very kind of novel approach in maternity care. So it is both remote and in person to really provide the hands-on care that you need, but in a kind of an efficient way that also lets the patient really get extra care in between visits. It's also midwife-led, which midwife-led with OB oversight, and we know that can lead to different kind of patient experiences and outcomes as well. And they also do a lot of care postpartum, which is a big gap where today we know that maternal mortality morbidity is really challenging the U.S. That's not just in the prenatal period or during delivery. It's actually a lot of the risk is postpartum. And today, just having 6 weeks postpartum, which a lot of women don't even go to, is just really not enough. So this company has a very novel approach to that, which we really like. I would say in the maternal health space, it's not saturated in any way. There's still a lot of need. There are a lot of companies that are developing virtual wraparound services, which I think is really important and plays a huge role in increasing access. But at the end of the day, maternity care is in many ways physical. And so the virtual care, it's a great wraparound. It's a great, addition to your core OBGYN care. But what we really love about Millie is that they are doing it all themselves. So you have a lot of control over how they're delivering it and making sure it's really an integrated experience for the patient.
Great, both excellent examples, so interesting. And so, yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing those stories, because it's when we think about FemTech, I think when we discussed this at the beginning, we could think of it in such a broad sense, but really a lot of the time when I talk about this to people, they just think fertility companies, and that's that's what you immediately go to when you think FemTech. But actually, even within the reproductive space, it's so broad. So thank you for sharing those examples with us. So when you're making investments, can you tell us a bit about the criteria that you look for when considering whether to invest or not in a FemTech company?
Sure. Yeah, and I will say that the way we evaluate companies is very similar to how any other venture capital fund does that. But the difference is that we are focused in women's health. And so we actually start first and foremost with what is the unmet need that is being addressed in women's health? Like, is this something that just really has there's need in terms of the population size, perhaps, or in terms of the level of the clinical outcomes that we're seeing, or just a lack of innovation. So we start first and foremost with that. And then everything else is very similar to how any other VC fund looks at a company. What is your product or service is actually really, really important to distill. I will say there are sometimes I speak with entrepreneurs and they have a lot of great information and context setting on the market and the need, but I actually can't tell what the product is. So yes, bring us along on the need, but also it's really important for us investors to understand what exactly is your product. And there is a tension, I will say, between do you have a very specialized, dedicated point solution, or are you a platform? There's kind of pros and cons, and there's definitely a lot of debate there. And the way I talk to companies about this is you probably need to start somewhere. You can't tackle everything all at once. But what is today's product, and what is that roadmap look like? So what is a product? Is it differentiated? Is it value adding? On the business model, something that's very important as well. Sometimes you have an amazing idea or amazing product even, but how will it actually get adoption and also be financially sustainable? So who is going to pay for this is a very important question. Is it the patient herself? Is it employers? Is it health systems? Is it insurance companies? Who is paying? And who is the gatekeeper here? And therefore, how do you drive adoption? Is maybe the physician needs to prescribe but is not paying for it, or is a gatekeeper in some other way? So it's really important for us to fully understand the business model in those senses. And team is really important as well. My biggest learning in the last couple of years and being in venture is that the fundamentals matter a lot, and we diligence that to the nth degree. What is the market? What is a product? And all of that. And the team actually is just really, really important and can really make or break the success. And this goes, this includes the skill sets of the team and beyond. Is how well does the team work together, and are the leaders are they really great leaders to build an organization? What I say is what we don't look for is we don't look for repeat founders per se. There are some venture funds that are very biased towards repeat founders. We don't do that because most founders in women's health are actually first-time founders. And in fact, most founders are also often inspired by a personal experience that they've had or somebody in their family, which I would say is quite unique. And so, we want to work with founders, whether they're first time or repeat founders, and recognize that this is a space where you're not going to have a lot of exited entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. No, that all makes sense. So do you have any questions for me? I know I'm the moderator,
yes,
but I'm conscious that I've been asking you all these questions and you've been speaking a lot. So happy to answer some questions the other way.
Yeah. And, as we discussed in our prep chat, I will actually love to pick your brain, and I'm sure the audience could learn so much, from your perspective, having worked with a lot of companies. So I know that you work with both startups and founders as well as funds. And I think for the conversation that we'll have right now, I would love to focus on the perspective of the startup. So I am generally really curious, and I would love to hear from your perspective, like, what are the types of issues, the key legal issues that founders should be thinking about, and how might that differ based on where they are on that journey? So if you're just starting out, you're just incorporating your company versus maybe you're in a pre-seed stage, you have an idea, you've piloted a little bit, to if you're scaling, just what are the different considerations that you would advise founders to think about?
Sure. Yeah. So, I think what I would advise on most levels, but particularly at the beginning, just don't give too much of the company away. It seems like I'm stating the obvious, but, and obviously I'm talking to you with your investor hat on, Alice. So we're probably going to have a bit of a debate on, obviously from an investor perspective, you want to have more control over the company because you're putting capital in. But I think, it's your company, and as founders, it's not just about the finances for you. It would have been a journey to even get to the startup phase. So I think just keeping the company as far as possible for yourself, and having investors effectively come along and be partners with you, but not to take over too much, I think is important. And I think, it works both ways. If you have happy investors and happy founders, then the company will become more successful. So, I think that there's always a debate. There's always a lot of, okay, well, I'll give you X amount for this percentage of your company. But actually, if the investor's happy and the founders are happy with the agreement, then the company's going to do better, which is then going to be better for everyone. The founders will want to see this work out, and the investors will want a higher return on their capital. So I always try and advise on a middle ground. It's different when you're doing an M&A deal, but when you're starting out, you want to really try and start out on good terms on both sides.
Actually, maybe you could pause there before you give
sure.
Some other thoughts. So yeah, it's really fascinating to hear this. Definitely, I think we might represent different sides of the table in this specific conversation. And what I'd be curious about is, what are you seeing in terms of how much of your company to give away in specific round? So I would say in, historical times, 20%, 30% was pretty reasonable in a round. In the difficult times in the past year, I've seen term sheets where it's 40%, 50% even. There are exceptions, of course, like YC companies tend to, even in this current batch, they are generally selling, it's like 10% stake. So I'd be curious, what are you seeing in those trends? And I know that we're, markets are opening up back up again and things are looking a little better than the past year and a half. So I'm wondering, from your perspective too, are you seeing that that ratio change?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you do have to effectively follow the markets in a sense. But I think regardless of where we are, I think I would always say to founders to retain that controlling interest, and not just in the shareholding space, but also on the board as well. So, you can, and I understand this is difficult because if you're in a position where you're desperate for money, then your bargaining power is quite low. So, you might not have a choice, and you want to save the company as opposed to effectively, selling yourself short and then having to wind up a business. So it's a difficult one. But I would say, 25% have an investor, a lead investor coming in to on an early-ish stage round. There are so many different factors to consider, and you want to look at it holistically. If depending on how much the company needs money, what stage you're at, there are lots of nuances involved. But I think the main thing to think about is just the controlling interest factor, but also on the reserve matters side, even if an investor is coming in at, say, 40%, you don't want to have a huge list of reserve matters that mean that you can't actually do anything with your company. You want to be able to be in a partnership with an investor, but at the same time, they're an investor. They're not an integral part of the business yet, because they're just coming in. They don't know anything, unless you're having an investor that's putting in further funding, in which case, you have a different arrangement. But if you're getting investment from a third party for the first time, then I think it's really careful not to give away too much, to make sure you have that interest that you retain. And also, from your perspective going forwards, making sure that there is room for further investment from other parties, because that's important too. It might be that the investor that you have on board is great for right now, but what about in 2 years' time, where you need some more money? Maybe the investor isn't in a position to deploy more capital and do a follow-on round, and you need to bring someone else in, in which case, there needs to be room in that pie for someone else.
Yep, absolutely. Could you share a little bit more about your work in women's health in particular? I know that you cover you cover life sciences broadly, so I'm sure there's lots of different companies. And within the women's health space, what kind of companies have you worked with? What trends are you seeing? And what are there special considerations, for FemTech and women's health companies that you think are unique from what you've seen?
Yeah, in terms of considerations, I think there are so many FemTech companies coming out right now, but they're in such early stages, and so it's difficult to tell. I mean, I'm seeing the full spectrum. I work a lot with FemTech Labs, and they're an accelerator in here in the UK, but they work with companies all around the world. Effectively, their program is to take new companies and accelerate them so that they become more than just startups. And so, from that perspective, they've seen all kinds of companies, from your typical fertility companies and apps, all the way through to perhaps, well, actually now in this cohort, I've just spoken to them recently about the latest companies coming up, but they're a lot more focused on menopause. And so I think the journey from what we originally thought what FemTech was about, which was effectively fertility, which ironically, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, fertility affects men as much as women, because obviously men want to have babies too. So ironically, that's the sort of the sector that's been most funded and most had the most interest. The sectors that perhaps don't affect men and affect women in later life are the ones that actually are now I'm seeing coming out a little bit more. I think it's been really quite challenging to see for femtech companies getting off the ground to get funding, and I think maybe this can be a discussion that you and I can have, from my perspective, just seeing companies come out, and from your perspective, obviously from the investor side, you're in a position of power in a sense, because obviously you have the money and you're looking for opportunities, but there are just so many companies out there that are trying to do good, trying to fix the issues that we face in society, and it's my perspective is that it's taken until now, really very recently, for women to even talk about these issues. And if we're not talking about them, then how can we find a solution for them? And with investors, obviously the femtech specific investors excluded, but investors generally within life sciences and technology, they've been predominantly focused on investments with, well, they're boards of male investors, effectively. Then, so if women can't explain what's going on, how do we expect men to? So this isn't a blame issue. It's just we are where we are. We haven't been talking about the fact that there are 37 different symptoms of menopause that I just found out quite recently, where really all you hear about is, I'm getting a hot flash. So, there's so much going on. And it's really about the fact that we just haven't been talking about these issues, in my opinion, as to why we are where we are here, and why it's such it's a growth sector, but it's so tiny right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you bring up a lot of, very interesting and true points around the stigmatization is challenging. And I will say, venture capital is a very male-dominant industry. In fact, mostly white men, which, sometimes it can be hard to really empathize with the conditions that these women's health companies are addressing. I do think, again, things are starting to change. There's more and more dialogue, more women in check writing roles. And I think you do think that makes a big difference.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to go back to some tips. So if you have, more here, would love to dive in.
More tips. Oh, okay. Oh, as in, what do we want people to be thinking about? Those sorts of tips.
Yeah, I stopped you earlier after the point around not giving away too much of the company, and I would love to hear what else you had for founders, and especially if there's something for women's health founders.
Well, I think as a general rule, protect your IP. That's something that I think people don't think about early enough. And look, it's the same reason why perhaps founders don't take legal advice early on. It's expensive. You're starting out and you're trying to save every dollar you can. So I think it's a difficult one to balance. But really, if you don't have your IP protected, then you're not going to get the investment that you need, because from what I've seen from both the company and investor side, due diligence, that's the thing that people want to know about. Like, what is the value in this business? They care about the knowledge of the people that have created it, but where is the value in it? And that's often in the IP, in the science behind it, in the tech. So how is that something that when you're doing your due diligence on companies, you're really looking at, and would you place the same importance on that as an investor?
Yeah. And I'd be curious to hear more when you say protect your IP, what specifically that means. Does that mean like filing patents, for example? So I will say for a lot of life science companies, we are looking a lot at the patent portfolio, especially if it was spun out of university, then what's the licensing rights and who owns the patents, things like that. And then we actually have seen companies that are life science companies that have also said, we're keeping these as trade secrets because they feel that like based on their technology, maybe it's an algorithm or some way of doing something where if they were to patent it, they actually feel like that would actually invite more competition and they would actually keep it as a trade secret. And so I've been surprised, but I've seen that as a strategy for some companies as well. This is not like your typical diagnostic, device or therapeutic company. It's kind of it's a different type of company. But that's definitely a trend that I've seen a couple of times is when you keep it as a trade secret versus actually file a patent.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's I would always say to protect the IP, but I mean, if it's that good that you can keep it as a trade secret, then you're really onto something. So I mean, it's from an investment perspective, I would be as surprised as you are to hear that. I guess it's in the same vein as saying don't give too much of the company away. I appreciate you can't give away the game, but filing a patent doesn't mean that you give away the game as such. It just means that you're securing your position. If it's something so nuanced, so niche that no one else is going to do it anyway, then maybe that's okay. But often, if you've thought about it, somebody else has, and it's really about what stage are you at, and I think in order to grow, it's usually the better strategy to protect as much as possible from the start and cover yourselves.
Great.
So, I mean, I think, let's just sort of thinking about wrapping up in terms of our conversation before we get to the Q&A. But one of the things that I'd like your thoughts on is, we talked about challenges for femtech companies generally sort of dotted around throughout the conversation. But one of the things that I think has been quite detrimental to the sector has been the lack of historical data. And that comes from a couple of things that we mentioned before. So the fact that it hasn't been until fairly recently that the term was coined, that it wasn't until the 90s that women and minorities were even mandated to be in clinical trials. But the truth is, if we don't have the historical data, then it makes it very difficult for companies to actually develop products. In some cases we're starting from scratch here. So how do you address that? When you're looking at companies that perhaps don't have the the decades of research that other life sciences and tech companies do have, but actually they've got this great idea, but they're starting out and they're effectively still in the building blocks where actually the product would have been skyrocketing if it hadn't been for the fact that we were only allowed to be part of these trials until fairly recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about that in two different ways. Like one is for traditional life science companies, and other would be for if you are like in the health tech sector, you're not developing a new drug or therapeutic per se, but maybe you're developing an algorithm or care delivery model. So to start with the life science component, definitely the basic biology in women's health is an area where we just haven't spent as much time historically. And so we don't have a lot. That's why we don't have innovation. That's, hormonal contraceptives have been the mainstay for 50 years because we haven't discovered other ways to have that effect and prevent pregnancy. So same with treatments for endometriosis and many other conditions. The solution has just been to shut down the entire system. So you essentially go into early menopause, and that's how we, treat all these conditions. So we really need to start with the research. And the good news is that there are more and more research centers that are funding projects and scientists to study the basic biology. You need that before you can actually develop new diagnostics and new targets. So in that way, the women's health space is definitely kind of younger than some others. Endometriosis, for example, we have, there's a lot of diagnostics emerging actually, which is quite incredible. Probably 15 companies that are looking at saliva or blood or even, the cells in your uterine lining and looking at all different biomarkers to see what can we actually measure to diagnose endometriosis, because there's no way to do it today really definitively except for surgery. So we're kind of starting in that diagnostic space, but there's not a lot of therapeutics because we don't understand the underlying biology that well. So to develop a new drug, you need to have a new pathway and a target to develop a drug against. So in that way, we see that the women's health life science landscape is very biased towards diagnostics and some devices as well, and just not as many therapeutics. There will be a lag between the basic science research and when we can actually see new innovations. But I'm confident that we will get there. And the other is the other way I think about data in women's health is around companies that are in the health tech sector. For example, in maternal health, we know that there are really challenging outcomes in the U.S. and there are many companies that are taking an AI machine learning approach to analyze women, pregnancies, and how can we better predict complications. Today, we still don't have great ways to manage complications. It's better to know than to not know. There's some things you can do. We still need more life science innovations like treatments. But at least if we can, take that big data approach and figure out who's going to be at risk, that's a great place to start as well.
Yep, fantastic. Okay, well, I think we could talk for hours about this, but I'm going to throw it open to the floor now to see if there are any questions. So, hey, Startup Boston people, if there are any in-person questions there or on the chat, I'll hand over to you guys now.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that we'll handle questions is if anyone in person does have a question, just feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to bring the mic over to you just so that way our virtual audience is able to pick up on the audio. And then I'll go ahead and ask the virtual questions that have been streaming in. So do we have any in-person questions? Perfect. I'm going to run the mic over. We'll get this to you in just a second.
Hi, I'm Fiona from Japan, and I built up a startup to increase the efficiency of workflow in clinics to try to decrease the pressure of clinical staffs, since in Japan, almost 75% of the clinic staff are women. So what my question is, sometimes it is difficult to let the non-female people to understand how difficult the female staffs are. So almost all the hospital owners and decision makers are men in Japan, actually. So how to make them to understand this problem and jump on board? Thank you.
How to make men understand the problem, right? So that's $1 million question there. Well, I mean, look, I would say, and Alice, jump in here, but I think women need to be comfortable talking about these issues first, and we're not quite there yet. But I think that being able to explain just in the same way that you would explain any other investment, any other issue, medical issue, in relation to life sciences and technology, just normalizing it is really the best way forward. And so it can be delicate, and we all do it. I'm a pretty confident person, but I'm sure that there are plenty of things that I would not be open to tell my male colleagues, even if they're just perfectly normal things. So it's a challenge, but I think once you've normalized it, taken that first step and just effectively saying, well, I'm okay with it, and there's no issue. It just, this is what it is. It affects 50% of the population. Then I think that's a good start. That's a good step forwards.
Yeah, and that's such a great question. And I would say that not only are health systems dominated by men in the leadership levels, it's also true in the VC world. And oftentimes, the way I think about it is, well, you don't need to have diabetes to invest in a diabetes company. You don't need to have cancer to invest in an oncology company. So, you shouldn't have to be a woman to empathize and see the value, and look at women's health. But that doesn't, always work. And a couple other approaches is, other than destigmatization, making it a normalized part of the conversation, is, well, what does matter to these stakeholders and the decision makers? So the head of a health system, like maybe what this person is thinking about are, outcomes or cost or experience of the patient. So then maybe there's a data-driven approach around this, depending on, what are the value drivers and most important things to the stakeholder. So, do women experience, poor care, and is that a risk for retention of this patient? Do women in this clinic or health system, is there a lot of costs associated with their care, or poor outcomes that we need to address? So I think, figuring out what matters to this stakeholder, because sometimes the gender equity argument isn't enough, or the experiential empathy argument doesn't work, then, and actually, I truly think it's important that women's health is not just a feel-good initiative. It actually is tied to business interests, whether it's reduced costs, improved outcomes, high retention, or whatnot.
Wonderful. And I know one of the questions that I saw online in the virtual chat was relative to, I think, Alice, with sort of who you are and what you're doing with RH Capital, it's so important. But the reality is the number of funds that are sort of focused on FemTech are finite. And knowing that there are probably a lot of founders in the room who are looking to, at some point in their journey, pursue venture capital funding, when you are kind of trying to quantify the market opportunity in a space that is still emerging and that there are a lot of unknowns, both from the VC side, do you maybe have any recommendations on how to really validate that this is an opportunity with, the potential for an incredible multiple? And then Sage, on the legal side, again, with an emerging industry, things change from a legal perspective. Do you have any sort of guidance for folks in the audience on maybe how to tackle some of those unknowns?
Yeah, happy to start with the VC perspective. The first comment, which is not the question that was asked, I would say before seeking VC funding is to determine if VC is appropriate for you and if you want that, because it does come with just a lot of strings. You are giving some ownership. Now you're going to have active investors on your board. Not everybody wants that. And also, is your business the type that can have hockey stick like growth, or is it? There's plenty of businesses that are self-sustaining, profitable, making great impact, but aren't necessarily the best for VC. So that's just the first question to think about. That said, when approaching, a lot of it's storytelling. It's really, for quantifying the market opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, there aren't great market size data. It is really hard to measure that. But the way I think about it is really, what is the need here? So, this is a patient population or customer group. What is their experience today or outcomes that is broken? And, how big is that in terms of both, volume of people that might be, part of your TAM, as well as just like how terrible is that experience or outcome, such that there is a really strong need to solve that. That's how I might think about it, in the absence of having any credible dollar figures. Or you could actually, do your own estimates as well.
And so I guess my question on the legal side, I guess I'll come at this more from a holistically as an advisor. Look, we don't know where the markets are going, whether it's from FemTech or otherwise. But I think, that unfortunately, if you are founding a FemTech company, you're going to have to work harder. And that's not something that I say lightly, but that is what it is. Having a very clear business plan where you know not just what you're doing from the outset, but being able to answer any question that anyone might have, that's so key. You have to know everything inside out. You have to be more on top of it, more on top of the numbers. I would say in terms of, how to think about, things potentially from more of a legal perspective, we talked about protecting IP, but in terms of the board structure, a lot of people actually, some people say to me, FemTech, so that must mean female founders. Well, no, actually, female founders is very different to FemTech. But, they raise an excellent point, which is the common misconception that people think that FemTech companies are effectively women-led companies. And, sometimes they are, but that's not what FemTech is. And so you can have, and I actually know plenty of male founders here in London and in the US that are starting out FemTech companies. So when you're starting out, whether you're male or female, I think it's good to have both representation on a board. If you can partner up, if you can have if you're a male founder, if you can have a female advisor or someone to show diversity, then that's great. On the other side, it's usually more of a problem the other way around, because we have far more women setting up femtech companies than men just generally, because it's just something that they're interested in. As Alice said, often it's someone that's had an experience and they want to try to solve that and to help other people with that same experience. To have someone that's different to you on board. That can be a man, that could be somebody with multiple years experience. It can just something different to bring to the table. I would advise on those things to think about.
Yeah. And just to tag on to that, we absolutely need the men. We can't have just women founders with women investors, with, women gatekeepers, it's important to have the men as well. And I really admire and applaud those that are in the space, and agree with Sage as well, as make sure you also have women on your leadership team in partnership.
Awesome. Do we have any other in-person questions? All right. So one of the things I'd love to end off in closing, just, with the Startup Boston crowd specifically, we have a lot of folks in the room who are probably founders on startup teams or potentially curious with starting their own ventures, some of which might be femtech ventures. So if you have any resources off the top of your head that might be beneficial to everyone in the crowd today, I'd love to hear what those are. Or if, Alice, I know you were able to shout out a few of the portcos that you have, just any folks that maybe these attendees, both virtual and in person, will be able to turn to for resources as they potentially begin that journey into the femtech space.
Absolutely. And actually, before that, I do see a question in the chat about investing in diverse founders within the femtech space from Natalie. So thank you so much for that question. So at our fund, we don't have a mandate around founder background, but I will say almost all of our companies are founded or led by women and people of color. And that is, I think that really speaks to just like who is innovating in this space, and diversity is something that we think about within our investment decisions in terms of like, what is the patient population being served? Are clinical trials representative of different populations? If you are a clinical care company with providers, well, how diverse is that provider group? So we haven't screened for that among the founders, but we actually ended up with a very diverse set of founders. And there also are a couple of funds that are not exclusive to women's health. It's, 1 out of 5 or 6 pillars, but these are funds that focus on diverse founders, and within that also women's health. I'll just name a couple of them. There's one called ZEAL, ZEAL, and one called SEA, SEAE. And so there's definitely a huge overlap in diverse founders and women's health. In terms of resources for any founders that are looking to get into this space, there's actually a couple of really great communities that have developed around this that have resources. So there's one group called FemTech Insider, which has a weekly newsletter. There's like a free one, and there's also some curated paid content. It's a really great source for all news women's health related, partnerships, funding announcements, etc. That's a really great resource. Another one is called Fem Health Insights / FemTech Focus. You'll notice that all of these have kind of the same word in it. This FemTech Focus is a podcast series where Dr. Brittany Barreto interviews founders and others in the space about their journeys starting companies in the space. And Fem Health Insights has a large database of companies and some other resources. There's also accelerators like FemTech Lab that Sage had mentioned. That's one. Another one's called Tech for Eva. So it's Tech, the number 4, Eva. Then that one is Swiss-based, also accelerator for early stage women's health companies. And I will say all of this did not exist 5 years ago. So it's really incredible seeing the growth in the community and the number of resources and just the camaraderie. And one last thing I'll say is that what I find in women's health is that it is a much more collaborative space than others, where what seem like competitors, or maybe even our competitors, in the business world, the founders might actually be friends. They might support each other, and of course, keep the walls where they need to. But I do find that this is a space where funds that would compete actually work together and co-invest. Companies actually, they collaborate, and it's a very friendly space because I think we're all really in it with, we're values. It's a values-driven approach, very passionate about it, and we all know that the rising tide lifts all boats.
Absolutely. No, I can echo everything you just said. It's such a collaborative space, and it's so wonderful to be a part of it. a woman starting out in the law, in corporate law, I didn't really have that same sense of camaraderie, and you're on your own quite a lot of the time, and certainly in the minority. And so, building up my career to partnership was quite lonely, actually, on that front. But now actually practicing within a sector that's just the complete opposite to the experience that I had is just incredible. So, perhaps it's because we have all had that lonely journey to get there, and so we all really do want to help each other. It's really quite special. And so on the resources, everything that you just said, FemTech Insider is great. I know the founder well, so I'm just going to give another shout out to FemTech Insider there. Actually, so when I was preparing for a presentation in San Francisco, actually earlier this year, I actually looked up the McKinsey reports. This was before I met you, Alice, and so I'm not saying this because you used to work at McKinsey, but they were actually very helpful as sort of to bring the sector together and to have regular reports on what they've been seeing in the space. So that's also something to look up. And obviously, if you have any questions, we're both happy to answer them. And if you wanted to have a chat on, just talk through things, then happy to do that. Just drop me an email. Hopefully, all my details are accessible. I'm sure Startup Boston Week has them ready to hand. But Sage, Revell, Brown, Rudnick. So I'm not difficult to find. I don't think anyone else has my name. And Alice saying RH Capital. I think that's again another pretty unique name. So.
Yeah, and thank you. I forgot about those reports. Thank you for the shout out. For anyone looking for them, it's called, the names are Unlocking Opportunities in Women's Healthcare. That was a report that was really on the life science side, looking at innovation trends, such as 1% of R&D in pharmaceuticals are for women's conditions outside of cancer. And then the other one is called Dawn of the FemTech Revolution. And that one, FemTech is specifically scoped around the tech-enabled consumer-focused care. So there's kind of complementary articles with research in the space.
Wonderful. And also just off the top of my head, on the VC side of things, All Raise is another great sort of group of people that are trying to ensure that when it comes to investing specifically in women, that there's equity and parity. So they have a Boston chapter. I'm going to shout them out because this is Startup Boston, but they have chapters in tons of different cities. So if you're tuning in virtually, if you traveled in, I can almost guarantee there will be one in a city near you. But that is all the time we have today. So thank you so much for attending, both our in-person audience and our virtual audience. And this event was actually part of our founder track, and it was a very important part of the founder track. And I just want to have a huge shout out to JustWorks, which is actually the one that is sponsoring the founder track and making a lot of these events possible as well. So if you didn't know, JustWorks is an HR technology company that's providing small and medium-sized businesses with access to benefits, payroll, HR tools, and compliance support all in one place. And they have dynamic software combined with a simple user experience and 24/7 expert support that enables entrepreneurs to grow with confidence. I've worked with companies that use them. I have personally used them, and they've always been incredible. So thank you for making this track possible, JustWorks. And again, a huge shout out to Brown Rudnick for recognizing the importance of this conversation and making this possible. Sage, Alice, you've both been incredible. So if we could give a huge round of applause